brothers and sisters of the Order, welcome back to the Order. I am Celtic Templar, and welcome back to another video on, well, Wild West history. And today, yes, we are talking about the Native American warriors, or Native American culture, during the American Civil War, which this story is sadly not much talked about in much form in American history, sadly, mainly because of the fact the United States kind of does not want many people to realize on the history involved in this conflict. However, the Native American culture that did survive in this conflict had a major goal and a major form in history. One that of which we as Americans still don't remember, or that in which pretty much a lot of times American people don't remember. Now, I want to put this out to y'all, of which we have to understand the story about the American Civil War for the Native American people. In truth, many times over, the Native Americans did not want to be part of the conflict. Problem is, they got dragged into it anyways. And five nations especially actually despised the United States government so much they actually fought back against them, and they fought for the Confederacy. They especially made, well, treaty alliances with the South, especially under the disguised name of a person by the name of Running Star, as his, well, Native American name was. However, this man was actually, well, of the Jewish nation, and it was actually stated that he actually, well, bore a said Hebrew star on his said uniform. Now, even though some state that he was actually, well, said person from California or somewhere, maybe in Texas, it stated he fought for the Confederacy and made alliances for the Native American culture. But that's a different story all entirely. Now, the five nations that are major, well, to have, well, supported the said Confederacy were that of the five nations, or the five civilized nations as they are known today. These were pretty much of the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and as well the Chickasaw, the Samoa, and as well the Creek. These were actually the five nations. And it's actually stated that these five nations became, well, forced out from their own homeland by the United States government, which is why they actually fought for the Confederacy. They thought it'd be better for fighting for the Confederate Army, seeing as though it was probably a better idea than fighting for the Union, who pretty much, well, kicked them out of their own homeland. Which is kind of why many Native American tribes actually fought for the Confederacy, not for the Union, seeing as though most of them were being kicked out of their homeland. Many of those Native American tribes that were kicked out of their homeland, especially, would actually fight for the Confederacy in general. However, that didn't stop the Union from making alliances with many Union tribes, or as they're called, Native tribes of the Union. Now, in doing so, as we can see in this map, this is a major boundary area. So, the territory region, as we can tell, this is where most of the Native American tribes were. Problem is, that is where we actually understand. Most of the Native American tribes, of which sided with the Confederacy, mainly lived either in the region of, well, the southern states, or including Oklahoma, or in the warring area known as New Mexico Territory. And that is kind of where most of them actually fought for the said Confederacy, but also for the Union, in which were divided. Now, we have a major story in history, though, that of the Ottawa actually fought for both sides. It's actually stated that there was a branch division on both sides who pretty much hated each other, and as well, many Native American tribes also fought for, well, each side in general, and as well hated another tribe, so this is pretty much the reason why each tribe fought against the other one. Now, the major tribes that fought for the Confederacy entirely were also seen in Texas. These tribes were pretty much also used in the Texas Army. However, as I stated prior, Texas was fighting for its own independence in general. And it's actually stated that the entirety of the Confederate Army, or the Texas Army as I should say, was mostly comprised of that, not just of whites, but many forms of Hispanics, Native Americans, and blacks. And pretty much though, when we see in films or in documentaries, it's mainly just white soldiers, which is entirely wrong. However, many of the said Native American tribes that fought for the Confederacy in, well, the Oklahoma region were stated to have actually fought as a type of tribal warfare. In other words, they used guerrilla-style tactics to destroy, well, Union supply lines. This actually is probably one of the most horrifying things that the United States government hated about the Native American culture. Major reason for this can actually be seen in, well, how the Native Americans fought in this tribal type of guerrilla warfare. Which, if none of y'all ever seen the movie The Revenant, especially in the very early scene, especially when we see actually, well, a type of massacre take place in the said region. guess what? That's how Native Americans fought, and many times over, many Union supply lines suffered this same type of casualty. Native Americans actually used type of guerrilla warfare strategies to defeat Union forces especially, and one of the most gruesome ones was actually known as the Chukwan Massacre. The Chukwan Massacre was actually stated to have taken place somewhere near Arkansas, and at least over I want to say a whole division of Union troops was badly massacred or badly destroyed. And it's stated, though, that they may have survived, but some of them were so badly gruesome and maimed that even many of them would not return home. And as well, we have to understand that the Texan tribes that actually fought for, well, Texas, that were pretty much wore in uniform. However, two type of Native American tribes that lived in Texas, such as the Apache and Comanche, still used a type of tribal warfare rather than being part of the Texas Army. These tribes were known as the Kiowa, the Chickawa, and as well the Jimano, the Cachuetion, and as well the Karkawaka, Teokawa, and as well Kadwa, and the Wichita. These tribes would actually be part of the Texas Army, and in general, dress in Confederate uniforms, or the drab gray color, and in doing so, actually hide in plain sight and use ambush-style tactics, which in truth was actually keeping Union forces outside of Texas. And the worst part is, Texas actually, well, had their troops use this type of form of guerrilla warfare for peak efficiency. In fact, it's actually stated that the Comanche and Apache, who sided with Texas, actually stuck to a type of form of guerrilla horse warfare, destroying Union supply lines and as well even attacking their most vital points, especially in the night. Union troops even nicknamed these people the Red Devils, as technically they were nicknamed this type of form. As well, the one major flag in history of the said Native American cultures can easily be seen from the five, well, civilized tribes with this. This is a Confederate flag with at least 5 stars. 5 red stars symbolize the 5 native tribes that actually were kicked out of their homeland. And as well, the Native American tribes would even establish their own name on the said Confederate flag of their said tribal people. They mainly, well, were part of 7 groups, but mainly converted into horse warfare rather than with said other divisions. But it's actually stated that due to the fact of how they actually fought many times over, the Confederates actually allowed Native Americans to have their own full division, especially, and even gave a command not by a white soldier or white civilian, but actually by a Native American person himself. Now, there is stories about many times over these people would have actually kept fighting even long after the war, especially up until 1867, which is pretty much 2 years after the war ended, sometime during the summer. But we don't know if this is true or not, or Yankee propaganda. But there is stories, though, that the United States did not actually keep their major end of the deal. And this can easily be seen in history books. For example, the Confederacy actually allied with the, well, many Native American tribes and hopefully tried to keep the peace. Thing is, though, if we take a look at the, well, warring region of New Mexico, we can easily see that the territory region of, well, Arizona and such would have actually had major conflicts both with the South and the North. And in fact, in many forms over, I might need to go back with this with Wild West history, because this type of territory region was said to have been a massacre for both sides, and especially with Native Americans getting caught in the crossfire. However, many times over, many Native American tribes were on both sides in this type of region, so it was hard to say who was actually controlling it. However, Native Americans that fought for the Union, now this is kind of a little bit of an easy duck, but also a hard one. In fact, it's actually stated that the territories that of Native Americans supported the Union were that of the Dakota Territory, the Nebraska Territory, the Utah, and as well Colorado, Nevada, and Washington. And that is a lot of region and a lot of Native American cultures in that said region. Now, there are also other tribes, such as the Delaware, and including the Nupas and Huron, the Mohawk, Choctaw, Nakota, Tupac, and as well Siouan and the Potawatomi, and including also to the fact that even the Creek Nation itself, which fought for both sides. Now, it's actually stated that there was a division between the Creek Nations, but this is where it really gets ugly for Native American culture. Now, I want to put this out here. Native American warriors actually fought in a gruesome type of guerrilla-style campaign, unlike that of which the United States was used to fighting. And the thing is, Many times over, the Native American tribes that were allied with the Union in the north pretty much were, well, ordered to stop said Native American incursions from the south. In other words, say like a Cherokee or the Choctaw, the Comanche or such, would actually invade north to stop Union supply lines, and in doing so, hopefully destroy Union support into attacking the south, which did not end well. In fact, most Native American tribes were wanting to stay out of the war, but still made peace treaties with the said Union. Problem is, it still did not work for the United States government, and this is where it gets really devastating. Most of the time over, many Native American tribes were actually, well, massacred in the form in history. Some Native American tribes were so badly wiped off the map, and some were actually just barely even surviving. One major form in history, we can even say in history, is actually sometime after the American Civil War, especially with the type of Native American groups that lived in the Dakota Territory. It's actually stated that, well, soon after the war, there was actually a peace treaty that was signed by the United States government stating that they would not actually cross any further westward with said Native American cultures. Problem is, soon after Custer came along, guess what? They've discovered a silver mine, and many Native Americans were later kicked out of their homeland, especially in the South Dakota region, where later on we would actually get the famous Mount Rushmore. And in truth, after this type of crime that Custer had committed, it's actually stated that many Native American tribes tried to appeal against this idealism, that the Native American cultures still need to own their land. However, the United States government was just wanting to willingly just give them money, hoping that this would actually appease them. It did not. In fact, the money has still never been touched by the said Native American cultures that have actually held that region, especially the Crow Nation. It stated that they stated the following, that they will never touch the said money. It was never about the money. It was about their land. And the United States government still wants them to take the said money. Thing is, though, they're never going to. And the amount today is actually up to $3 million. That's enough to pretty much put the entire point of the Crow Nation up in the form of a major wealthy point. But the thing is, they still won't never touch it. And no, said member of this Crow Nation would ever touch it. So, that's kind of the sad part about it, until Native American culture gets its way back. So, the worst part also is, the United States kind of wasn't the best guy you wanted to make a friend with, due to the fact many Native American tribes that made allies with the Union later on, regretted, siding with the Union, due to the fact they were later forced to become, pushed into reserves like that of the former 5 great nations of the said Native American culture, or the 5 civilized nations. And of which, this is actually really what's bad for the 5 civilized nations in Oklahoma. They lost more land when the war ended. And the worst part is, it got worse for more Native American tribes. Many of them were later on forced to join the Union government in some other regions. However, there are also many other type of, worse areas. In fact, the Cheyenne, and as well the Usabag, and the Pusani, the Cope, and as well many others such as the Pocan and the Lembe were later on forced to actually withdraw their land and as well become more of a civilized type of race. Yeah, this is termed civilized race. That was plural put by the United States government after the war against all Native American tribes that fought against the Union. And that's saying something, meaning they lost all their rights, their culture, everything, wiped off the face of the earth. And the worst part is, it got worse. Now, in only a couple of tribes in the New Mexico Territory managed to survive, and those were the ones that sided with the Confederacy. But those that fought for the Confederacy in Texas and as well also in Oklahoma lost their rights completely. And the worst part is, the Union really didn't make any good things for them, especially after the war, for their own allies. Many Native Americans that fought for the Union lost their rights, lost their land, and as well only managed to keep their culture only a little bit. And the worst part is, this later led to the said Native American Wars, or Indian Wars as the Union proclaimed. But those former Confederate Native American tribes that fought for the Confederacy did not want to fight anymore, believing that if they did, it would only cause further problems for their people. However, the Comanche and Apache were one of the 2 people that still believed that they had a chance of winning. Maybe, but we don't know, because it technically turned into a slaughter. Now, we understand though, but Native American culture has its own forms in history, but we have to understand the Union caused further problems for them, especially many of them that were well west of the Mississippi. In fact, many of the Native American cultures that fought for the Union actually were pretty much, well, in the said tribal regions of their former ancestors, mainly that of the Delaware tribe that lived in Delaware, or the Iowa tribe that lived in Iowa, which is how the state got its name, somehow. But the thing is, many Native American tribes were forced from their land, and as well worse, they had their rights taken away, they had their guns taken away. See, this is why I don't approve of the United States government taking away the Second Amendment. As well, there were even more worse things. Sometimes they even forced them to take away their own horses, which they couldn't hunt. They couldn't do anything. And as well, even after the American Civil War, many of those Confederate Native Americans were even forced to become slaves, which is not the best thing for the Native American culture. Even though the 5 civilized tribes in Oklahoma did somewhat have slavery, they technically had to enforce a form of slavery on their own people, which in the process made it harder for them to survive. And the worst part is they lost their hunting rights and everything. And many times over, they lost many types of, well, bison, and which is what they needed to use to survive, especially in the Great Plains region. The worst part about it is the United States didn't care about the Native American culture, especially when we see after the American Civil War. It only made it worse for them. In fact, this is where the dark part of American history gets worse and darker for them, especially by the United States government. At least, pretty much with said farmers and including civilians who actually, well, lived with Native Americans, at least they actually viewed them as equals. Problem is, the United States government did not. And in fact, I have to put this out here, many times over, Native Americans had a major form of military warfare against the Union, especially during the American Civil War, mainly with the Confederacy, who of which used a type of form of scouts, as well warfare of guerrilla type, and including cavalry, while the Union used the Native Americans to technically as a defense mechanism, and as well as scouts in their own army. That's about it. But, in truth, this was technically a major form in history that the Union had to deal with. But Native American warfare in the American Civil War was incredibly gruesome, especially for a type of group of Union troops who were slaughtered at the Battle of Sangamon Creek. It's actually stated that Native Americans used a type of guerrilla-style combat to trap Union troops in a said ravine. When the Union troops actually were stated to have marched into the region of Texas, or northern Texas, they later on got their, well, own asses handed to them, especially when Confederates, actually under the command of Walking Star, actually was stated to have fought back. Walking Star immediately ordered that the Confederates actually draw the Union ever closer into the region, and in doing so, trap themselves around the said region. In other words, the Confederates pretty much used guerrilla-style combat to destroy the Union supply line, and even Dover, well, pretty much forcing the Union to, well, push forward. This is where it gets harder and harder for the Union to actually understand, but the problem is, most information on Native American warfare has been left, well, written by the Union, which unfortunately has hardly any information. But there is some, well, broadcast of information that actually did show this once when I was young, which would be Journals of the American Civil War. And it actually did speak about how the American Civil War with the Native American tribes used such guerrilla tactics that even though they managed to, well, cut off Union's supply lines, it would still cost the Union tremendously. But in truth, Native Americans were appreciated by said Confederate troops. In fact, they were even welcomed as brothers in arms, as we can see in this image here. It's actually stated that Native Americans were welcomed as heroes and such to fight for the Confederacy, and as well are a major part of the Sons of Confederate Veterans even to this day. Problem is, the United States government did not recognize Native Americans as warriors or heroes of American Civil War, or even participating in the American Civil War, until sometime during the 1940s, which is a long way from when this ended. And the worst part is, Native Americans' culture and all forms of history were pretty much destroyed. In fact, there have actually been many tapestries out of which the Native Americans created to speak of this great heroic warfare. In fact, even type of dances and creative warfare is one of them. Now, I pretty much am part only a little bit of Native American culture, such as the Apache and Comanche, and as well some part of the Chickasaw and as well Cherokee. But there are other Native American tribes I am also part of. But the sad part is, due to the fact the United States government technically wiped out most of that information, it's kind of disappointing, to say the least. But I have to say one thing to y'all. When it comes to history, we have to remember it. And in doing so, that's actually what's happening in South Dakota to this day. It's actually stated that along the area of Mount Rushmore, there's even a statue being created for the said Native American people of a said, well, proud Native American warrior that's, well, slightly bigger than that of Mount Rushmore. So we can understand of how big this would actually be. Sadly, though, Americans don't realize on how long this, well, statue would take. In fact, it only started being made during the 1980s, and it's still being constructed to this day. In fact, it might be another decade or another generation before we see it fully completed. Which, sad to say, I might not be able to see it. But you can understand that Native American culture is still being fluent throughout history, especially here in many parts of the South. In fact, many Native American cultures, as they state, well, fought for the region of Texas. However, in parts of Louisiana, Florida, and as well many parts of, well, Virginia fought for the Confederacy also. But the problem is, many of them were actually wiped out, or worse, left and destroyed, and their history was destroyed with it. But still to this day, the Union did something very worse to the Native American culture, and that was destroy their lands, destroy their people, destroy everything that of which their people were proud of, only to subjugate them under a type of form of government, that of which they did not want to support. And the worst part is, the Union made treaties with the said Native American cultures, but worse off, they later on destroyed them. I'm sad to say, but the United States is kind of a major boogeyman to the Native American cultures. Even though they made peace negotiations with them, they later on broke them because of silver and gold, rather than actually supporting them in a type of form. In fact, we can easily see these in these type of territory regions, especially if we take a look at our modern map. Especially if we compare the two, we can easily see that, well, those territories, the reason they're made that way is because they're known as territories, so that way a said Native American culture can be subjugated by a said division of cavalry, which the United States did, especially after the American Civil War. It only made it worse, especially after so many years. It was only a major victory such as the Battle of Little Bighorn that actually proved that Native American culture can still thrive. Problem is, we still don't see much of it today. There have also been many battles that of which the Native Americans fought in, such as the Battle of Chilliwack, the Battle of Hiena, Conqua, Dowana, and so many others. However, they've been nicknamed in the type of Native American culture and have not been recognized by the United States government. And in truth, Native American warriors actually used type of warfare to their peak efficiency to defeat the Union mostly. However, as I stated, the Union hardly used Native Americans to fight in the war, rather to use them as a self-defense, especially if Native American warriors later on attacked said tribal regions, or in this case, attacked supply lines and as well settlements in the north, which actually did happen, especially in the region of Iowa sometimes, and Kansas. And pretty much as we hear in history, the Union actually stated to have, well, disgraced this type of form and wanted the Native Americans eradicated from the type of form in history, especially those tribes that fought for the Confederacy. But they did more than just do this to the Confederate tribes. They did it also to many of the tribes that they were allied to. I'm Celtic Templar. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe. Also click that bell button for notifications, so that way you understand when the next video comes up. As well, check out our Facebook so that you can learn more history. As well, there will be more information down in the description below, as well where you can actually learn more about this history. And as well, if any of y'all want to learn more on said Native American tribe that fought in this type of war, let me know down in the comments below, and I'll be happy to do so. Anyways guys, this has been Templar. Have a great day.